Why don't you get us started by kind of giving us an introduction to yourself and your research interests and what you work on, and also explaining why you're hiding the secrets of the leprechaun magic and the secret old Irish manuscript that explains the vision that I had of the earth goddess telling me that as an Aquarius, I need to save the whales.
Wow, what a vision. Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. This is actually my first Crowdcast event, so hopefully it goes well. But yeah, so as you mentioned, I am a Celticist. I'm working on my Ph.D. right now at Harvard University in their Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures. My primary research focus for my Ph.D. work is on early medieval vernacular, mostly religious texts dealing with ideas about guilt and redemption in both Ireland and Britain. So because of the time periods I work with, I mostly work with Old Irish and Old English. So I work closely with the English department as well. And it's been really interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that time period. I'm currently, one of the courses that I'm a teaching assistant for is on the Irish Supernatural. So we have talked a bit about the fair folk and their magic. I don't. So I would prefer not to get into any secrets of the fair folk. They don't take kindly to that from what I've heard. But yeah. So that's mostly what I focus on. But I also have done some work in the other Celtic languages and literatures. So I've worked on some Welsh stuff and some Breton and stuff like that.
If you visit my website, thefairfolk.geocities.com, you'll find some of the secrets. Actually, I went with you a couple times to an Old Irish reading group, right?
Yeah, we had an Old Irish reading group the year that I was on my gap year, and we read a couple of texts. It's pretty slow going. Old Irish is a difficult language to learn, but it's a little bit less daunting to do it in a group.
Yeah, no, it is the hardest Indo-European language, I believe. Could you define Celtic for us?
Yes, I'm going to be very strict in my definition of it. There is some controversy even within the field about the term Celtic and how it's used and how useful it is. So at its base sense, the term Celtic really describes a set of languages. So we use it to describe groups of people who speak or spoke a language that fits into this branch of Indo-European. And the surviving ones today, well, surviving to a greater or less extent, would be Irish, Scots Gaelic, Manx, and then in the those would all be what we might consider Gaelic, or the Gaels. And on the Brythonic side, it would be Breton, Welsh, and Cornish. And so we actually have an entire course on this in our department. It's a gen ed course that talks about the Celts as a people and how useful that term is, what it means in terms of culture or something like that. And I think the most useful way to use it is just thinking about these groups of people that spoke related languages. And it really came about during the 19th century with the rise of Romantic nationalism in Europe and people wanting language to be a unifying force and tying it to culture and all of this stuff. And so people became a lot more interested in these Celtic traditions and connecting them to one another. But when we were looking at the medieval stuff, it certainly wasn't something that they would have thought about. So somebody in Ireland wouldn't necessarily have been saying that they are more connected to the Welsh than to the English. They would have seen them all as a completely different thing. So it's useful as a branch of Indo-European. So when we are looking at literature, just like we can connect literature in Old Norse to Old Irish to some of the Vedic stuff that we see, you do see similarities like that, but it's really sort of more useful as a language grouping than in another sense. And in terms of the languages themselves, you have two main groups, often referred to as Q Celtic and P Celtic, which just talks about a function of language when it's split. So Breton, Welsh, and Cornish are all more closely related than Irish, than those three languages are to Irish or to Scots Gaelic or to Manx. And the other three are more closely related to one another than to the others on the other side. And in that way, you can sometimes make connections between culture because it's a much later shift. So when we see Irish, Scots Gaelic, and Manx, there would have been cultural contact and the languages would have spread by migration. So you can see how there would be similarities to Scottish culture and Irish culture through contact and through migration. And the same thing with Breton and Cornish, and to an extent Welsh, because the language spread to France, according to some scholars, from Britain. So as they're taking their language, they're also aspects of culture are also spreading. So in that way, there's sort of a cultural connection, but I think it's the most useful term when it comes to languages rather than any other aspect.
Okay, hold on. My interests are going to show here. You said, according to some scholars, is there debate about the origins of Breton? Do some scholars today see it as survival of Gaulish?
Yes. There are some who think that Breton developed on the continent in some way. I'm not as up to date on that scholarship as others are. I actually have a friend who's a native Breton speaker who is probably more up to date on that. One of the things about Celtic studies that's really frustrating for me that my friend and I are trying to fix, but it's slow going, especially considering we are graduate students and don't, we can only affect so much change at a time. But we found that there is not a lot of communication between Francophone Celticists and Anglophone Celticists. By and large, they don't publish in the same journals. I mean, we only read the big ones when it comes to French Celticists, and I'm sure it's the same for them. So when I've gone to Brittany and spoken to people there, there's just not a lot of contact between the two, and it's really frustrating because it'd be great if there was. But so I don't know a lot about the scholarship coming from the Francophone side. We do, in our program, we do have to learn to read French and German, but I can read it, but I'm not fluent in it yet. So it is slow going for me to try to read anything in French. I think that's where most of that divide comes from. In all honesty, English speakers and native French speakers are very territorial about their languages and can often be very snobby about having to learn the other. So I think part of it is just that there's not a great amount of fluency to be able to easily read something in the other language. But also, I'm sure that there's other reasons that happens. But there is kind of a real lack of communication there.
That's interesting. Well, and it's funny, that these things really do come up between language people. But then it's like, I don't want to learn freaking French, right? It's like, that's not what I signed up for. I want to read Irish, right? But then actually, with Irish, so much of that stuff is in German. Like, I would be so just cut off from being able to find out much about Old Irish if I couldn't read German, because it seems like half of the good stuff about Old Irish is in German.
Yeah, I think they recently changed the language requirements since I did them. But when I first got into this program, we actually figured out that we had the most language proficiency requirements of any department on campus. We had to either pass a certain level of course or take a written exam in modern French, modern German, and Latin, as well as taking at least 1 year of a modern Celtic language, at least 1 year of a medieval Celtic language, and at least 2 years of a second medieval Celtic language. So, so we do have to demonstrate an ability to read in German and French, and it is really important, depending on which languages you're studying. There's a lot of German scholarship on Old Irish. There's a lot of French scholarship. But I think that also is not only detrimental in terms of the secondary sources in the scholarship, but in terms of language acquisition, there's one Breton language course for adults that is taught through the medium of English. And most language courses in Britain and Ireland for Irish, Scots Gaelic, Welsh, etc., are taught exclusively through the medium of English.
Right.
Which means that if you're not fluent enough to take a course, an academic university level course in French, it's really difficult to learn Breton. And the same for French speakers. So there's just that extra barrier to fluency in the language. So it really is not just the barrier to the scholarship, but also to becoming proficient in those Celtic languages themselves and having access to that material. So hopefully we can work on repairing that divide in the next coming decades or so.
So I can quote you as saying, abolish French in the coming decade.
I wouldn't say that, but I would love to see. I would actually love to see more access for Francophone speakers to, Irish and Welsh. But it's easy enough to say that. It's very difficult to actually see that happen. But I will say there are universities in Brittany that offer courses in Celtic languages, but my understanding is for the most part the people who teach those courses are primarily Anglophone rather than Francophone, and the courses are taught through English, or at least were in the past. France has some interesting laws when it comes to languages you can use to teach.
Right.
But yeah.
Just interesting how, modern language feelings and politics enter into the approach to these medieval languages.
And there was a similar commitment. My friend tells me it was perhaps even more aggressive in France to kill the Breton language, there was by the English government to stamp out the Celtic languages in their realm. So there has been a great effort on both the Anglophone and Francophone sides to successfully do a lot of damages to these modern languages. And the French government is still very hostile towards the teaching of Breton.
Well, I find, we're kind of wandering afield here, I guess, but it's an interesting side road. I find that often the damage is most completely done in the first generation that misses it. And I think that that's something I've seen on Indian reservations as well. You know, it's the first generation that misses it, that most completely is cut off from it, right? Like when it, for the first time, when you have to struggle to learn it, it's like, oh, this is something we ought to, you know.
Yeah, and there has been an increase in as far as I know, most of those languages in terms of people taking it. But another problem is that because they're being lost as sort of native languages, there's fewer people who speak them at home from birth, which means my friend has found, especially in her study of Breton, she's a linguist, so she does look at this stuff. So a lot of times now you have people who are teaching these languages who only have, in terms of the European framework, ideally a B2 level of the language. So they're not even at the highest level. They're not even necessarily fluent. That is like a very advanced intermediate stage. And these are the people who are teaching the language to the majority of learners, which alters the language significantly.
Yep.
I wouldn't say, there are those who say that it does damage, but the alternative is just to have nobody teach it. So it is definitely changing the way that all of these languages are spoken. And I've heard from my friend who studies modern linguistics in Ireland that it's similar in the Irish language schools there, is that the requirement to be a teacher is about a B2. And because there are fewer people who speak it natively, the majority of people who become teachers are about at that level.
Yeah, I've seen the exact same thing in Arapaho.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about the supernatural, what kind of texts are you working with? What are some key readings in the supernatural and in medieval Celtic literature?
Well, a lot of what we talk about is in the mythological cycles. So there's 4 main cycles of what I think most of us would think about when we think of more secular literature, as opposed to the explicitly religious stuff. As you know from your work in the Old Norse stuff, it's sometimes not a clear distinction between the two. But what we mostly think of when we think of the medieval Irish literature, there's 4 main cycles. There's a mythological cycle, the Ulster cycle, the Finn cycle, and the cycle of the kings. And so a lot of what we talk about in the supernatural stuff when it comes to medieval things is from that mythological cycle. So dealing with some of the gods and the god type mythological people, I guess. So if you read the Battle of Moytura, that's a lot of the Tuatha De Danann would usually be considered in that. In the course that I'm teaching now, we focus a lot. We started out with some of the older material, but now we focus more on the folklore, so the stuff that was collected in the 19th and 20th centuries that has a lot of supernatural tales in it.
Any good readings in that people could find?
Yeah, there's quite a few collections that have been published. Let's see. Lady Gregory published, so there's a collection called The Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland by Lady Gregory. And that's a lot of the older, especially 19th century stuff, I believe. Sean O'Sullivan also has a number of collections. There's some newer stuff by a man named Eddie Lenahan, who's done a lot of good stuff. He's an author. He actually has some YouTube videos as well that you could probably check out.
Cool. And then as far as the Tuatha De Danann stuff, I can so often find the same old public domain translations online, but are there good translations of that material that are more recent, maybe a little bit more scholarly sound?
Well, when it comes to scholars who've done a lot of work, Elizabeth Gray has a translation of the Battle of Moytura that's quite good. I mean, it's new in the sense of a lot of the material I work with was published in the 19th century and hasn't been republished since. So Elizabeth is a 20th to 21st century scholar. So it might be from like the 70s or something, but it's relatively newer. And that's a pretty good translation.
Okay, hey, I'll take it. 1970s. It's not 1870s.
Yeah. Yeah, when one of the things that I work with, since I do a lot of the religious stuff, is material about the saints, which is very similar to the supernatural stuff as well. You can find a lot of interesting stuff in the saints' lives, and I work a lot on a text called the Martyrology of Angus. It's not really a martyrology. It's sort of a calendrical collection of verses. It has one verse for every day of the year in which he names in this quatrain at least one or more saint or religious figure, or sometimes important political figures. But it's like a 9th century text. Approximately. The dating's a little bit contested in some circles. But the only translation that I have access to is from Whitley Stokes, and it's a late 19th century translation. So it can be sometimes really hard to find newer translations and even editions of a lot of this stuff.
I'm a little surprised that there's not more competition to do that kind of thing, but it may be partially just due to the difficulty of the language. There's so many fewer people who really master it.
Yeah, it's a very small field. So the number of people who are in a position to do so is pretty small. And many of them, I suppose, focus their sights on other works.
Well, let me use that as a segue into a question that Payson asks over here. Payson asks if you could comment a bit on the difference between the Celtic languages now and the older versions, how similar or different they are in your point of view. And part of why I think that's an interesting segue is with something like Old Norse, native speakers of Scandinavian languages have maybe a small foot up in vocabulary and grammar. I wonder how much native speakers, or at least since childhood speakers of, say, Welsh or Irish, are in a position like that with these medieval languages. Do you have any thoughts on this sort of stuff?
I would say a speaker of modern Welsh would have an easier time with what we do have of the medieval Welsh material, which the stuff that we get is a little bit later for that. A lot of times it starts around the 12th century. The Irish stuff we get is older, but even the stuff from the 12th century, I think, would be much more difficult for a untrained modern Irish speaker. There is actually a spelling reform in the modern Irish language in the 20th century. So even reading texts that are just 100 years old can be quite shockingly different from texts that we've written in the last 50 to 60 years.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And so when you get back to what we consider Old Irish, which would be from about the 6th century to about the 9th century, or maybe a little bit later, maybe closer to 600 to about the late 9th century up to 900. That stuff is quite different, and Middle Irish as well. And then when we start getting into what we consider early modern Irish, I suppose, which is around somewhere in the 13th century or so until maybe the 16th or 17th century, it starts to be a little bit more familiar, but so from about that point on, it's a little bit more familiar, but you'd really have to be somebody who has read a lot of even just stuff from before the spelling reform. So if I suppose if there is a native Irish speaker who's not specifically trained in it, but was maybe nerdy enough as a kid to try and read some of the older pre-Chiton stuff, they might have an okay time with the early modern, but the language in the medieval period is significantly different for Irish. The language in the Welsh period, I think, would just take a little bit of getting used to. If anybody here, I think we're probably all pretty good English speakers. If you've ever tried to read anything from really before the 17th century, before the spelling was really codified in dictionaries, you can notice that writing is really almost dialectical. There's a lot of weird spellings of words, so it takes a little bit of getting used to. And I think it would be the difference is a little bit similar in the Welsh stuff as well. So it's like the spelling is a little bit off, but for the most part, I think a dedicated but untrained reader would probably be able to get through it.
So that's interesting to me that Irish has changed so much more dramatically, or at least, I mean, part of that, of course, is how old those texts are. But it also seems like during the same amount of time, it's changed more dramatically. But then also, it's amazing what a dramatic difference there is between the oldest preserved written Irish on those Ogham inscriptions and then even old Irish manuscripts. I mean, it's fallen down some huge waterfall between those two stages too, right? Because you look at those early Ogham inscriptions, it looks like Latin, right? I mean, it's such a classic Indo-European language. But then there's all this weird lenition and ellipsis stuff that happens in that transition. I don't know of any other language that just radically mutates every few centuries the same way.
Yeah, I think actually that actually reminds me of another point. I think one of the big stumbling blocks, besides the general spelling of the words and stuff like that, one of the big stumbling blocks probably for an Irish speaker would be that in the Old and Middle Irish period, they had grammatical lenition and stuff like that, but it wasn't actually reflected in the spelling. The only letters that would show that lenition would be, I think, like an S or an F. Mostly the words that when you lenite them, essentially that letter goes away. They would mark those with something that looks like a punctus delens, which is how a writer in a manuscript would often mark that they were deleting a letter. And that's actually how later in the language they would end up applying that to all letters, regardless of what actually happened to the letter during lenition. So if you look at the pre-Chiton stuff from maybe the 19th or 18th century, you'll see a little dot above some of the letters to show that they're being lenited. But when you read a medieval manuscript, you don't have that help. They didn't mark it. It's still there. We can tell that it's, well, not me, but somebody who's better trained in those linguistic aspects and stuff like that. You can tell that it should still be there. They just didn't write it down. So I think that would also be tricky for a modern Irish speaker who was used to seeing that lenition was being marked.
Sure. Oh, I hadn't quite realized that. My familiarity is much more with the older side of things. I've taken only a little bit of a look at modern Irish and then at Scottish Gaelic and at Welsh. Just kind of, looked under the hood a little bit. That's interesting. So, I mean, that's a huge challenge, even if you're already kind of used to that system, to just get used to how the system is marked differently.
Yeah, because that gives us a lot of the grammatical information. So in a lot of cases, that's, how you recognize right away whether something's in the genitive case or in another oblique case. Or it'll give you some other types of information occasionally. And of course, pronunciation information as well. But it can be really tricky when you're reading either from the manuscript itself or from an edition that hasn't been heavily sort of modernized in the way that they represent these things. It hasn't provided that lenition for you. It can be pretty tricky.
Yeah. Huh. Well, that's interesting. This background I did not have. So there's tons of challenges here.
Yeah.
So switching track a little bit, Martin Ellison, who, by the way, in some ways, actually kind of got the ball rolling on this crowdcast because he asked me about Celtic studies, and I thought, I know what Celtic is. Asks, what similar themes are there present between medieval Irish and Welsh literature? Are there common stories between medieval Irish and Welsh literature?
There are common elements and things that seem to come from common stories. I think the fact that we don't have a lot of medieval Welsh material surviving, and that it's much later, is a little bit harmful in that aspect. But we do have, for example, Irish kings from Irish stories being mentioned in some of the Welsh Mabinogion material. In one of the medieval Welsh tales, there's some discussion of, the pig Torquaith is supposed to be coming over from Ireland and rampaging through Wales. And so we do have some crossover figures. We do have a lot of what we know of what we consider the Celtic gods and stuff like that do have reflexes in both the Welsh and the Irish material. So there is some crossover, but we don't get a lot of, at least not in the surviving stuff that I've seen. We don't necessarily get a lot of like almost exactly parallel tales where we can really see, one tale being told in two separate places.
And then I think some of the putative gods' names are present in Gaulish inscriptions too. Is that right?
I think so. Some of the Gaulish inscriptions are some of the older Celtic material that we have. So a lot of what we have in terms of knowledge about the older Celtic mythology, I suppose, and names of gods are included there. One of the interesting things is you can see in the way that the languages mark time, like the days of the week. The Welsh stuff seems to have adapted, for the most part, the Roman names of the day and just given them Welsh names. Irish doesn't do that for a good chunk of the week. So it does have that Roman influence for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. But for Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, they have this interesting thing that's clearly a reflex from the Roman Church. But the name for Wednesday comes from the term the first feast. The name for Friday is basically just the feast in Old Irish, and the name for Thursday is the day between the feasts. So instead of just copying over the god names, which Welsh certainly does, they've actually renamed it in another way that still has kind of a Latin Roman influence.
Yeah.
But I always find that really fascinating.
Interesting, and actually kind of in common with Icelandic, with Friday being fast day, right? Like it's not a calque on the Roman names, but it's a Roman church influence name. That's really cool.
And if anybody's trying to look this up, that's not the name that they use for fasting now, or it's not the word that they use for fasting now in Irish. So you'd have to go to, there's an online dictionary that will give you Old Irish if you're interested in looking that up, dil.ie. And you can find the word for fast in that dictionary is where these days of the week are coming from.
Cool. That's a useful resource. And side questions to that from what you were talking about. Do you recommend any particular translation of the Mabinogion?
There's two that I quite like. One of them is from the 70s by Patrick Ford. And another one is by Shauna Davis. It's a little bit newer, and I think a lot of people find the translation to be a little bit more modern. But if you have the resources to get two, the nice thing about them is that they are both the four branches of the Mabinogi and also a collection of other tales that are often included with the Mabinogi tales. But the sort of other tales that they attach to it are different in those two texts. So those are the two that I would recommend. I think a lot of people go towards the more modern one by Shauna Davis. But if you can pick up Patrick Ford's as well, or if you can access it at a library, I would definitely say go for it.
Cool. And my second side note to that is the Celtic language that I've been looking at the most in the last year is Lepontic. So, yeah, they had an Etruscan-related alphabet that has a lot of pretty non-coincidental looking similarities to Elder runes. So I'm been digging into that, and it is morass trying to get through some of the stuff where it's like there's so few sources in the first place, and then finding the research on it is so hard. So Cameron Patterson over here says, what was the cultural background to writing down the Old Irish epics like and I don't speak Irish, so it's going to sound bad, Tainbo Cuailnge and the Tale of Oisin, etc.? What would have motivated Christian monks to put it to paper?
I think what a lot of times we as modern readers have in our minds is that we see a very strict distinction between secular and religious. And we have it in our mind that people who are focused on religious stuff are very much against the secular. But actually, in a lot of medieval societies, you get a lot of, the people who were writing in that period in most of Europe would have been people trained in the church. So it would have been monks. But they keep a lot of that secular stuff because they are still interested in it. We actually have, I don't have the name off the top of my head, but we actually have in England a bishop or an abbot or somebody writing a letter complaining that the monks are too concerned with stories like Beowulf and not focused enough on Christ, and stuff like that. So we do have a lot of evidence from the area at large that they were still really interested in this. The other thing about what gets written down in this period is the idea of who has access to what we would consider publishing and text making, because books were very expensive. So the people who had the money to do it besides churches would have been very wealthy families. So people who were considered kings or wealthy nobles, I suppose. It was a different political system at the time. But so that's really what the upper class would have been interested in. And the monks themselves were very fascinated with this stuff.
Makes sense to me. Yeah, you see it not just in the Celtic-speaking world. That's a great example with that English sermon or letter that you mentioned. I think, if I'm not wrong, that he doesn't say Beowulf, but he names some other old Germanic hero that we actually don't have stories about preserved in Old English, suggesting that there was like Kenilworth or something, or was it like Hildebrand? Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but
yeah, it was one of the other heroes. Beowulf was just the book that's on my shelf. That's the name that came to mind.
Right.
But yeah, it was some secular hero. They were so when they would be sitting around telling stories, it was always these adventure stories, these heroic, legendary tales, and not so much the religious stuff. That does make it a little bit difficult. One of the things that I often make sure I explain to my undergrads is that we don't have anything that was written down before Christian influence, and that's true in most of Europe. So it's really, even these sort of secular tales were written down by someone who was looking at them through at least somewhat of a Christian lens. But at the same time, the conversion to Christianity wouldn't have been a wholesale, sweeping, really philosophical conversion. So the hearts and minds of the people would have still been holding up these traditions, and would have still really enjoyed these fun, legendary adventure tales.
Sure. And that's true far beyond the Celtic speaking world. Sure.
And it's true, in Ireland throughout its history. That was a real struggle of the Catholic Church, was to get people to turn away from some of their pagan beliefs or practices. It's one of the reasons that, or one of the interesting questions when you study folklore, is how did all of this very lore survive? How did all this keep going throughout this country that's been historically very Catholic for a very long time? The church, as sort of an institution, had a lot of trouble sort of getting even the religious people in the community to stop holding on to their traditions.
And speaking of some of those pre-Christian traditions, Chava down here is asking, is there any mention or evidence of human sacrifice, like the bog bodies, in those written sources?
Not in the sources from the Irish people themselves. We do get a lot of the information that we get about sort of the early Celtic peoples, not in Ireland, but in Britain and in Gaul, is from classical writers. And then we also get travel writing, like Gerald of Wales, who talks about Ireland and Wales in often a very disparaging light. So he will talk about certain barbaric practices. I can't think of specifically things like human sacrifice, but he does tell a story of a kingship ritual where the king of that territory, I want to say it's in Northern Ireland that he's talking about, I think it's the king of the O'Neills, who mates with a horse, and then they slaughter the horse, and he bathes in the soup that they make with the horse, and then they eat that stew. It's very much stuff that you can tell somebody is looking down on the community, and it's either an Irish person was just pulling his leg and trying to make him look foolish, or he was trying to make the Irish people look barbaric. We don't really have much information at all about the practices of paganism in Ireland, certainly not by the Irish themselves. We do have things like St. Patrick, who is not an Irishman himself, writing about what he sees in Ireland, or later saints' lives writing about what the saints encountered in Ireland. But we don't really get any sort of self-confession of practices like that. But we also really have no we don't really have anything coming from the Irish themselves during a period when those things would have been practiced.
Right. And I think that horse ritual, I think there's something very similar in a Vedic ritual, because I've seen that come up sometimes in discussions of Indo-European religion, how there's some unusual parallels there, even though obviously, like you said, the description of the Irish ritual is deprecating, that there may be some grain of truth in it.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. There is a lot of people have found a lot of interesting parallels between the Celtic stuff that we do have and other Indo-European traditions and religions from vast different parts of the area covered by Indo-European speaking peoples. But yeah, so and we do know there was, there is a lot of indication that horses were important for the traditional religion. and stuff like that.
And the same in Scandinavian. On a different note, on Patreon beforehand, we had a question from Stephen McKay, who wanted to know, do you see Irish heroic literature as being more similar to, of Norse genres, the mythical heroic sagas, the Fornaldarsögur, the sagas of Icelanders, Íslendingasögur, or to one of the Eddas? Were the motivations for writing that Norse literature and the Irish sagas similar? I guess it's kind of two separate questions, but what genre would you compare them to in the Norse stuff?
Oh, what a question.
It is large.
Yeah. Well, we get a few different types of heroic literature. So one of the big things, the Ulster cycle, is really a story about the mostly centering the group of warriors in one particular region. So it's really sort of based on King Conchobar and his men. And so that's really a sort of like territorial kind of thing. So we get a lot of stories focused on a specific area and them kind of fighting and beating the warriors from Connacht and Leinster and all of that kind of stuff. But we also have the Fenian cycle about Finn and the Fenians, and they're kind of usually considered outlaws in a lot of instances. And so they're sort of like wandering around, and it's a very different type of heroic literature. It's kind of hard to class it as what we think of as genres in terms of other cultures and other literatures.
Sure. Well, and the first one you mentioned made me think of nothing so much as like the saga of Rolf Krake, where you have this king, but a lot of the stories are really about the guys who are kind of loosely connected to him. They're in his court. Sometimes you get stories of them separate from him, and then sometimes it's all these guys together. That sounds sort of similar to that.
Yeah, that is a useful comparison, I think. It is, because you can get sort of, within the saga of Rolf Krake, you can get, the story of Bothvar and his birth and all of that. And you can get the story of like individuals within that. And the Ulster cycle certainly does that. You get stories that focus more on Cuchulainn than on Conchobar. And they all sort of tie back to like a group of people led by one particular ruler rather than focusing specifically on one person at a time.
Yeah. So, I mean, that seems similar in that way. We had a long conversation not too long ago with Armand Jakobsson at the University of Iceland, who has a lot of opinions about genre and how useful or not useful the term is, and these boundaries are. And it sounds like that's just as true in Ireland as in Iceland.
Yeah, I will say we don't really, I can't think of anything that would be similar to like a family saga that like traces one specific. I mean, we do have like the cycle of the kings, which will trace, in many cases, people who seem to be historical kings. But for the most part, the historical, the legendary heroic material is, in a lot of cases, I think of kind of similar to things like Homer, where they're talking about heroes that lived hundreds of years before the version that we get is being spread. So these aren't necessarily people that would have been reasonably like your great uncle or something like that you would have a direct connection to. It would be somebody that you could theoretically maybe trace your lineage back to if you were really motivated to do so. But these were very much like heroes of a legendary past. Mm-hmm. So if you think about I kind of have the Greek stuff on my mind. I was a TA for a course on the ancient Greek hero this year, so I've had to read a bit of it. But if you think about like in Works and Days, when he talks about the ages of the world, and how like the ages of the world were a little bit different. So you get the mythological cycle that's very disconnected from the medieval Irish world that people are living in. And then you get this sort of like legendary material that's certainly after that mythological stuff and is full of people who were mortal people, but better than us.
Right.
So it's still happening in a world that is disconnected by a few hundred years, but still a world that you can mentally disconnect from and imagine that things happen differently in that world than they do in your own for that medieval audience. So it kind of, in my mind, it's kind of separated in that way in sort of these like ages of the world. And heroes can do a lot of things that we can't do because people back then were just able to do that, or at least some people were.
And then that kind of heroic literature, I would say, is kind of underrepresented maybe in the Norse stuff. I mean, the Volsungs are probably the closest thing to that. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're sort of used to in English using this term saga for some of that old Irish literature. Is that a term that you use? Is that current with scholars of this material, or is there another term that's preferred?
It is still used. I personally try not to use it because I do think that it creates in the mind, especially for people who are maybe new to the field or unfamiliar with the field, I think it connects it a little bit too strongly to the Norse material. You can draw similarities. If you look at heroic literature from many different cultures, you can draw similarities if you want to.
Sure.
I think, the sort of ideal person changes over time, but at the same time, there are certain things that are cross-cultural. But I think that tying it that closely to the Norse material is a little bit unhelpful, at least in the beginning when you're first getting into it. But
sure.
The reason I think that it's used and that it is useful in some circumstances is that, because the next question then is, what would I call it? And I do not have an answer for that. I don't know that there is a useful word in English to represent it. So it is probably the closest thing that you can say, but I try to avoid it when I'm dealing with people new to the field, just because I don't want to make that connection. I do mostly refer to the cycles. And again, we have 4 main cycles. And I guess that's kind of what we get in terms of genre or saga in the Irish material is you can have a tale and often put it into one of these categories, either mythological or historical, the cycle of kings, or the Fenian cycle, or the Ulster cycle. And in a lot of cases, the manuscripts will kind of have like stories that might fit into each.
Okay. I like Irish cycles too. I've been to the Harley Davidson in Dublin. Let's just trying to get you to sign off in anger. If the Earth Mother thing didn't do it, maybe that would. There's a couple questions down here in the questions and answers section. Let me see. Marie asks, how do classical sources fit into Celtic scholarship? Are they considered useful sources, or are they too biased?
I think they're considered necessary to an extent, because when we're looking at Caesar and stuff like that, we don't have any Celtic sources from that period. So that is sort of all we have to work on. It's just really important when you are using them as sources to have that caveat in your mind that, this is somebody looking in on another group of people and not necessarily doing it favorably. A lot of,
Right.
I mean, Caesar is going to war. He's writing propaganda to make himself look good. So as long as you have it in your mind that, I mean, everybody is going to be biased. We all have our biases. So even if Caesar weren't writing this largely as propaganda, he would still have his own worldview that he's viewing this other culture by. So I think as long as you can keep that in your mind, they can be useful sources, as long as you make it clear that this is where that source is coming from. This is where that information is coming from. He does say that he has a druid friend telling him all this, but that's kind of a double-edged sword there, because on the one hand, maybe he's just saying that. On the other hand, if he does have a druid friend, are we sure that this druid friend is giving him entirely accurate information? And can we even think that a druid from one area would really have knowledge of what other tribes are doing? So there's a lot of things to just keep in mind about bias. But just because the source is biased doesn't necessarily make it not useful to an extent, especially when it's really the only source we have for that period.
I think it's a great answer. All right. And Carl asks, do you see a difference in the presentation of folk beliefs in Irish manuscripts following the change from the so-called Celtic Church to the Roman Church?
I don't know. I'm not a manuscript expert in that period. A lot of the stuff that I work with is well before the shift, because that shift would have come around quite a bit later. One of the reasons for the Norman invasion of Ireland given was that the Celtic Church needed to be brought back into line with the Roman Church. But even that was arguably a mixed bag in terms of success. So Irish church stuff has always been a little bit different. So I'm not really sure about exactly what we would see differently in the manuscripts from that period. It would be interesting to look into.
Going back to a literature subject for a minute, my colleague Dr. Vicky Grove asks, is there a particular collection of Irish heroic tales you would recommend for someone new to the subject?
I think that the Ulster cycle is a good place to start. If you look at stuff about Conchobar and Cuchulainn, it's quite popular and accessible in terms of you can find it. I will put out a caveat that it is strange. It's very strange for people who are first encountering it. So if you find that the story itself is weird and confusing, that's almost certainly just what it is. And so a lot of my undergrads will be like, I don't understand this stuff. Like, I must be doing something wrong here. And no. So I will say go in expecting it to get weird. But the Ulster cycle stuff is fun. One of my favorite tales, if you want to look at a specific tale, I really enjoy the story of Mcdouthow's pig. It's a feast story. It's a trickster story. There's a big fight at the end. But in terms of weird stuff that gets a little too much into, you need some sort of cultural knowledge of medieval Irish practices and legends and stuff like that. I would say that one's pretty accessible.
Okay. And remind us again, good translation to approach that in.
I'm actually not sure, but Mcdouthow's pig, you should be able to find a translation online pretty easily, maybe through Celt.id. But yeah, I think I would start, if you want to look at a specific tale, I would start with that. If you are interested in the mythological stuff, the Battle of Cath Mortura, Elizabeth Gray translation, that's pretty good. It also gets a little bit weird, but I don't think that one really gets any weirder than any other ancient or medieval mythology that you're going to read.
Which is all pretty weird.
It's a bunch of mythological beings doing some strange things. But that's a fun text. And I think Stella mentioned that translation of Cath Mortura is in the public domain.
Okay.
So
easy.
I always like stuff you can find for free online.
Sure. I tend not to trust it unless it's been vetted by someone like you. But yeah, it is nice to not have to pay.
A lot of the stuff, like, you can probably find a translation of Mcdouthow's Pig that comes from a university website, and I would say those are, for the most part, decent.
Okay. Cameron Patterson asks, visions of the afterlife in Celtic mythology, such as Tir na Nog or Anun, seem to emphasize abundance and beauty and youth in contrast to the rather grimmer and shadowier afterlives of the Norse, Romans, Greeks, etc. Have any scholars explored this theme?
I'm sure there have been. But when it comes to that stuff, when you look at the Celtic otherworld, I guess it is a little bit less bleak, or at least it can be. If you get more into some of the modern stuff, the things that happen to people who go to the otherworld and come back can be pretty bleak, or it can be great and really work out for you. I'm not sure about people who have specifically looked at Tir na Nog and things like other cultural otherworlds or afterlives. But I would say most of the stuff that we have in Irish is more about what I would call the otherworld rather than specifically an eschatological, like, afterlife after you've died sort of thing. There is a fun phenomenon in the folklore from, like, the 19th and 20th century that sometimes it seems very similar. So you hear stories about people being taken, and a lot of times that's after they've died. In some cases, it's while they're still alive and they will come back. But sometimes you do encounter what we might consider like spirits of people who have died before when you cross over into the other world. So it's a really, not always, I would say it's rarely exclusively something like an afterlife. It's very much the other world where these supernatural beings live and come from and sometimes take you.
Well, and to be dead is to be other. So I suppose it's sort of there's a category similarity there. Huh. Martin asks, are there any other defining works for Old Irish other than Tornison's Grammar of Old Irish and or Stifter's Cinquedel? I think of W.P. Layman's Old Irish introduction. Do you recommend that? I kind of liked it.
I haven't looked at that one yet. I have seen Stifter's. Stifter's, I will put the warning out there. Stifter's Shen Gradelic is a good text. It's a good work of scholarship. I will say, in terms of it being a beginner introduction to Old Irish, it is really only friendly to people who already have a good linguistic background. If you're not already familiar with linguistics, it's not super accessible. It does rely heavily on the reader already having a good grasp of linguistics. But again, Old Irish is such a difficult language that it's really difficult to put together a friendly book for a true beginner. But if you're looking to supplement, I would say, especially if you're trying to learn Old Irish on your own, Turnison's grammar is still really the big defining resource. But you can also look at Quinn's workbook, which will, De Vries's Student Companion to Old Irish Grammar is really helpful to use with both the workbook and Turnison's grammar. Quinn's workbook will almost present it like it's a living language, so it will give you like tasks to translate and then have solutions in the back. So when I did Old Irish at Berkeley for the first time, we used a combination of the three. We used Quinn's Old Irish workbook, De Vries' Student Companion to Old Irish Grammar, and Turnison's grammar sort of all together. But that was also just around the time when Stifter's Shanghai Delic came out. So that wasn't an option to us at the time. But if you do have that sort of background, I think that Stifter's work is really helpful. And I like, it has a lot of nice charts that I can read. I'm a visual kind of person that likes to see things organized neatly. But those are really the ones that I used when I was learning.
And with the name Sifter floating around, I'll put in a good word for his scholarship on the ancient continental Celtic languages. He has been the most informative person for me to read on those subjects. So just to put out a good word while his name is floating around.
His scholarship is very good. Absolutely. His scholarship is very good, which is why I don't want it to come across that I don't think that that book is a good resource. I just think that if you were to look at it, you would say, oh, look, a friendly introduction. But if you don't already have some background, it might be a little tricky. But the scholarship is quite good. And I think that it does explain it nicely if you do have that foundation.
And I just realized that Samantha had asked the very question, what resources do people generally use to learn Old Irish? So it sounds like we have a good answer here, kind of a combination of three texts: reference in Turnison, workbook in De Vries, and then
Quinn's workbook is really
Quinn's workbook, and then De Vries' companion.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do still know professors who teach their Intro to Old Irish class by going through Turnison cover to cover.
Oh my gosh.
I think that it's a friendly way to learn it, and I'm not sure it's a really effective way to learn it. But I would say that grammar is still considered the defining work. I don't think anybody's had the guts to try to make anything that is intended to top Turnison's grammar.
Well, it's an excellent grammar. I mean, as a connoisseur of grammars of old Indo-European languages, it is excellent. But yeah, to use that as a front to back reading textbook, I mean, boy. At the University of Georgia, the Old Norse class was sort of taught like that. It was basically read Gordon this week, and then we'll start reading text. But, you know, it's not easy with Old Norse to do that with Old Irish. It's like, you know, well, just jump into calculus. It doesn't matter if you've had algebra or not. You know?
Yeah, and it is a very daunting language. That's one of the reasons that I like Quinn's workbook. It's not a new thing. Quinn's workbook has been around for a while, but it does break it down nicely. So it'll treat it like you're learning a modern language in that the nouns are broken down into categories of like O stem and A stem and all this stuff. And so Quinn will take it and say, we're just going to look at O stem nouns and this class of verb. And he'll give some sentences. That workbook will give some sentences to put together for that. And so it breaks it down in a much more friendly and digestible way, I think. So the workbook is quite nice especially if you're trying to teach yourself. I don't recommend that you only try to read the grammar of Old Irish without any assistance. It does make it a little bit overwhelming.
And I'll put in sort of a good word for Winfred P. Lehman's book. I want to say Introduction to Old Irish. The title is something like that. I used it a long time ago and actually found it pretty approachable. But of course, you have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because at the time I'd already done a bunch of old Indo-European languages. But I found that it was a pretty good way for me to kind of hit the ground running with it. I never hear anyone talk about it, but it was useful for me. So just that's another thing that's out there. I'm sure it's out of print from whoever published it.
That's the other thing is that De Vries, Quinn, and Ternuysen should all still be in print. Ternuysen, if you're looking at somewhere to get it directly from a publisher, you can look at the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies. They still sell the nice new ones rather than finding a secondhand. Most of mine, I think I have 3 copies, all of which were published before 1950 and are very much falling apart. So I recommend trying to find one of the newer ones. I think that they probably do still publish like addendum and stuff like that with the newer editions. But I think they're all still in print, so you should be able to find them all without having to pay like insane amounts of money to a reseller.
Yeah, I have a super classic Ternuysen over here somewhere. Well, I've really appreciated you taking the time with us, Heather, and it's been great to see you again. Anyone want to throw in a question at the end here? Or Heather, would you like to make some concluding remarks and or explain my dream about the Earth Mother?
I don't even want to tackle that. I am not at all sure what that would be.
No, I'm sure you get some of that stuff too. I mean, both Norse and Celtic stuff attract some of the mystical stuff, and I'm never even sure where it's even coming from in terms of the original sourcing. But there's but it's like they have different vibes. You know, the Celtic stuff seems to attract some of that, like I said, like, you know, Earth Mother stuff, but I'm never really sure, like when I read, you know, the Tane or whatever, I just don't see where it's even coming from. Like I don't know exactly how it attracts these notions, but it does. And then if you don't know this already, I just want to break your heart by telling you that the #1 selling book in Celtic studies on Amazon is someone's rune magic book.
Yep, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So there's also confusion between these things.
Yeah, I will say something that I think a lot of people these days don't realize that I think is important to acknowledge. The Druids did not write anything down. So any Druidic practices happening today are a couple hundred years old at most. So we don't, very much intentionally, we don't know anything about the medieval and ancient practices of Druidry. It did seem to go away with the rise of Christianity. The Druid classes and families, for the most part, seem to have gone into other related professions. But we don't really have any sources for what Druids would have done in. I mean, we've got them mentioned in literature, but we don't really have any actual sort of historical sources for that.
Very much the same in the Scandinavian sources too. Stitch asks, what do you think of modern scholarship? What do you think modern scholarship of medieval Celtic lacks? Like, what are things you really wish there was more research done about?
Well, I think in a practical sense, we still have a lot of stuff that hasn't, like a lot of manuscripts left that haven't been edited. We don't have editions, let alone translations of. I think some of the more practical things of somebody going through and creating editions and translations, which is very time-consuming, difficult work. And I'm not at all surprised that we're lacking a lot of that. I think it would make the field more accessible to new scholars if we had more material available. And we do have, I mean, you're always limited by what actually survives, but we've got a number of things. And certain things, like I said, the Martyrology of Angus that I work with was edited in the 19th century. I think the second edition was 1905. So no one has bothered to go through and re-edit that. So I think that there's a lot of things that, just practically speaking, I wish were more available to people who can't hold the manuscript in their hands and read straight off of the page, which is hard to do no matter how well you know the language. And also, you can only do it if you live near that library. So I would say I would really like to see more of that.
Well, maybe someone's dissertation project, although editions are really tough dissertation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again. And I hope you'll come back and answer more of our Celtic questions sometime. And for now, I will wish you all the best, and the same to all my Patreon supporters. Thanks everyone for your support and for coming this morning.
Thank you for having me. I would love to come back if you wanted to do a part 2 sometime.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. All the best, everyone. Thank you again.